without further ado, what I'd like to do is to introduce Chris Gentle. Chris is partner of Insights and Research at Deloitte, and we'll be going through some new research and insights to share with us, which is great. You've probably got Chris's profile in the pack. The one thing that really stands out to me is it says, Chris discovered negative equity in the early 1990s. Didn't we all? I said, well, okay, a lot of people are too young to remember that. But as part of no, not me, unfortunately. Thanks for that, Chris. It was part of a small two-man team at Newcastle University that identified this. And he's actually written a book after liberalisation where he correctly predicted both the inception of the euro and the challenges that the inclusion of Greece would have had of joining such a monetary union, and that was back in 1997. So Chris, have you got any hot tips for me, please, about shares or anything like that? Then I'm certainly willing to take advice on that. So thank you. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris up onto stage, please. Chris, thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the introduction. I would say bye Google, Richard.
Thank you.
A warm welcome from Deloitte. We're delighted to be hosting everybody this evening, and I'm hoping that in terms of what we're going to talk about tonight is about growth. And I thought I'd start with a reasonably easy question, given it's in the evening. Who in the room would like to be richer, even just a little bit? I'm assuming most people would be. And essentially when we're talking about growth, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how individuals across the country can be more wealthy. And what we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years is that there hasn't been much of a change in terms of the individual wealth of the UK. In fact, it's only now just getting to the level it was in 2007. So we've got quite a challenge. In order to look at that challenge, 2 years ago, I set up a project in Deloitte called UK Futures, which essentially kind of said, well, and if you can think 2 years ago, we really were in the mire then in terms of the economic situation. How can we get out of this? What do we need to do? And what role can business play in terms of actually kind of driving that growth and prosperity in the future? Because although it's not kind of widely kind of seen in the marketplace, etc., that obviously the way that wealth is created then actually kind of obviously makes jobs for everybody around the UK. So we set up this project and started to look at this. And what I wanted to cover today is what's going on, particularly around big business. Obviously, many of you work in London and what's happening there, but also what's happening kind of across the regions. Because although there's been more growth in London than there has elsewhere, there is still a big question about when are we going to see kind of that spreading across the regions as well. So that's one of the things I want to cover today as well. So that's the kind of program we put together, UK Futures. Essentially, it's about how do we kind of get wealthier as the UK. There's one kind of problem with that, which is if you think about any other country, whether it's Brazil or China or Germany or France or the US or Canada, they've got exactly the same idea. And so we're all kind of effectively now competing against ourselves. Since the financial crisis in 2008, which is 6 years ago, that's what's been happening around the world more and more, is that global competition has been enhanced. So it's very well kind of the UK saying, oh, we're going to have something like UK Futures and we're doing this. But even within our own Deloitte network, my colleagues in Australia have created a similar kind of program called the Lucky Country, which maybe there will be, I don't know. We've done it in Canada as well, where we've looked at kind of productivity, and also in the US. So just within the kind of Deloitte network, we're looking at this, and we're also kind of taking this across Europe now in terms of what we're trying to do there as well. So it really is a kind of big global issue. The other thing I just want to cover as well is obviously in terms of digital. You're probably trying to get the connection now between what I'm talking about here and digital. Well, there is one. Last week, we were very fortunate to have a round table at number 10 Downing Street with the Prime Minister around this topic. And one of the things with 15 CEOs of clients that we invited along, one of the things that was very clear is the ones that were growing quickest, the ones that were growing internationally, the ones that are most getting the most out of exports were the digital businesses, because it's obviously much easier to grow on a digital basis internationally than it is any other way. So I think the two things do collide in terms of what you do in the day-to-day and what we're talking about here, because the more digital business we can have in the UK, the easier it is to export, the quicker you get those revenues from those exports or those investments abroad, and that actually then turns into wealth in the UK. And there were 2 or 3 businesses there that were doing fantastically well. There was a company there who are based in the city, but operate around Forex. They've got a turnover of over £500 million a year, and they only employ 55 people. So you can see how quickly you can grow when you're digital. There was another company there that deals in the rights for football and football websites and various leagues. They run all the business out of the UK, but now they've got offices in all the major cities around the world. There's another big client of Deloitte called Wood Mackenzie. I don't know if you've come across this business, which originally came out of an investment bank, but operates in kind of data from mining, oil and gas, energy. They run out of Edinburgh, and they have just sold themselves for just over £1 billion, something that we helped with the transaction with. But that's, again, is a business that basically came out of the UK, is all about kind of data and information and digitizing that, and then selling it to every major oil company in the world. So just 2 or 3 examples there of how digital and this kind of growth story that we need to have in the UK is coming about. So let me kind of just dive into what I want to talk about today. Some more boring economic points maybe, but just to give you a foundation about where we are and the work that we've just done. So this piece was with businesses in the UK that are over £1 billion in turnover. There are about 347 of them in the UK, including Deloitte. And what we were looking at is what were their investment plans over the next year, 2 years, and then in 2017. Now that's pretty important, because the thing is, if businesses don't have the confidence to invest, clearly we're not going to kind of get the kind of virtuous cycle that I've just spoken about. Well, the good news is that we found that amongst those companies over the next 2 years, they're planning to invest over £200 billion in terms of their businesses, much of it around international expansion, but not moving from the UK, so using the UK as a base. So hence the title of this, Launchpad for Growth, because these companies, which are UK and UK-based companies, so it also included, let's say, companies that like Telefonica, who own O2, but have more than £1 billion revenue in the UK. So very kind of confident about using the UK as a base to go internationally, number one. Number two is, what are they expecting? So in 3 years' time, they are expecting, or we estimate that they expect nearly £500 billion in terms of new revenues. Now that's a heck of a jump in terms of actually how they're going to kind of develop and what they're expecting. And my guess is that there are lots of you in the room who actually kind of work with clients, etc., who need to help these companies and sell your services in order to actually kind of help them get these revenues, because it's a fantastic opportunity, but how do we get there is a kind of key point. The third point was around, obviously, Deloitte works a lot in kind of accounting and tax and those kind of things. And there's been a lot of talk about big companies sat on mountains and mountains of cash, which you're probably kind of aware of. We've done work here within my team, which actually shows that cash is actually distributed quite unevenly amongst the big companies, roughly on a kind of 80-20 rule. So 20% of the companies have 80% of the cash, and vice versa. Well, what we asked the companies here was, are you going to kind of raid those cash piles in terms of where they are at the moment? I think they're estimated about 800 billion. Are you going to raid those in order to fund your investment? And the answer was pretty clearly that they're not. So they're still being quite conservative, these big companies, in terms of what they're going to do. And they're going to actually use cash flow and revenues that they have at the moment, and also with almost 0% interest rates at the present time, they're going to use that as well, which probably is a smart thing to do. But the thing is, they're not going to go gung-ho. They are still being pretty cautious in terms of what they're doing. Just a couple of points to end in terms of what I'll cover. One is that, business can do some things around this, but also government can do some things around this. And I think there's a lot that business can do. And that's the one area I want to focus on, which is if you look at the reputation of big business in particular and CEOs, and I have told our own CEO this, that their kind of trust levels are going down and down and down. The Elderman study that's done every year kind of shows that this is the case. So business has got its own role to play in actually how it can reposition itself and show it that it's part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And that's one of the areas where, in order to regain that trust, they need to focus on that. The final point is, well, how should you go about optimizing investment? Because clearly, it's fine to put together a piece of research and survey that says, oh, it could be this big, etc. But the big issue is actually how when a decision is made, actually then, which country do you go to? How do you go about this? Do you buy a company? Do you organically set up? Do you use digital marketing to get into that marketplace? How do you go about it? Is the really key thing that's important. So just a few things at the end of the presentation, just as the how-to on this one. So the first thing is how are big businesses changing their behavior? So if you think back a year, we were still hardly growing as an economy. People were still very, very kind of cautious. And we can see from this slide, when we asked them, so these are the kind of board members of these big companies, what's the difference between now and then? It's pretty kind of consistent. So overall risk appetite is growing, willingness to invest in unfamiliar markets has grown significantly, support from investors to go and do this, ability to invest in opportunities, willingness of management to pursue this, and inventing new products and services. So you essentially got a kind of perfect storm that's happening, which is when we have investigated these kind of things in the past through our CFO survey, everybody's kind of gone, oh, we're pretty unconfident, we don't like to take risks, we aren't inventing new products, we're not willing to go to other marketplaces, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden, it seems to have just flipped to more of a perfect storm where all this stuff is coming together. So one of the reasons why we're seeing what we're seeing is because of the way that the kind of major clients are operating at the present time. But they're also quite cautious. So just let me just explain what we've got here. Although 80% of them were in favor of investment, if you look at this, 50% of them said that they're going to make investments and return cash to shareholders. So they're still pretty cautious about what they're doing with their investors. And as you can see at the top there, 11% would continue to strengthen their balance sheet and 9% return cash to shareholders. And as we've seen, basically dividend levels have been at the highest and share buybacks have been very high. And so in 2014, they're still being pretty cautious. They're trying to keep their investors and the stock market happy at the same time as they're trying to do investments at the same time. So they're trying to tread that path. And so it's very much a kind of thoughtful recovery in 2014. But that kind of changes when we get to 2015. So what this infographic tries to do is say, this is what's expected in the blue in 2014, and then in the green, how that increases in terms of the investments that they're going to make over those periods. So it seems like they're cautious now, but they expect 15 to be better than 14, which is obviously good news if everything stays on track. That they don't get shocks, whatever happens around Ukraine, et cetera, may kind of destabilize the situation. So that's have to see. In terms of which sectors are doing better than others in terms of investment or in anticipating to make more. So we've got healthcare and pharma, chemicals and manufacturing and telecommunications being the big ones in 2014. And we're beginning to see that through obviously the big merger that's looks like is going to be announced between Pfizer and AstraZeneca, which is on the table at the moment, is an example of that kind of change that's taking place at the moment. Whereas when we get into 2015, that balance changed a little bit. So consumer business, energy, and financial services are the ones that are making the biggest investments in 2015. You can also see down the bottom in terms of who's making the biggest ones by size. and it's the smaller ones, i.e. between 1 and 5 billion in terms of turnover, as opposed to when you get in 15, the bigger businesses start to come through, which is all kind of encouraging in terms of what's planned, and only, as you can see, on the end, 2% are actually waiting until they get to 2016 before they're going to invest. So literally all big companies are now kind of planning what they're going to do, and it looks very, very kind of positive about where they are. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that increasingly this is kind of about international, and this is one of the things that really kind of surprised us about how quickly British companies want to go international. You can already see that 72% of them are generating more than half their revenues there. But what was interesting was those that at the moment, so if you just look at the bars we put here, so companies with between 10 and 24% of current revenues outside the UK, or 25 to 50%, so the ones that are more UK-centric at the moment, you can see how they anticipate over the next 3 years that they're going to really try and boost their revenues on an international basis. So whether or not they can achieve this, I'm a little bit skeptical, because if you look at what's happening around export, etc., that they're not moving that quickly. But the aspirations of these companies are huge at the moment, and so as I said, that I think they really kind of do need potential help about how they're going to make this work and pay. But clearly they set out the aspiration, which wasn't there probably even 12 months ago in terms of where people were at the present time. Now, the question then is, where to invest to get the best growth. And I think one thing that's really important here is that lots of people have talked about BRICS for a long time, and it absolutely is not a BRICS story. So everybody's not going to go to Brazil. Well, maybe they're going to go to Brazil in June and July, but I unfortunately aren't. But I will take tickets if you've got them. But Russia, India, and China being the BRIC countries. But you can see here that it really isn't that kind of story. That companies are actually kind of much smarter than that, and they're actually looking at a range of companies, a portfolio of companies. Paul Walsh, who used to run Diageo, was at an event of ours a couple of months back when he was retiring, and he was saying, if you expect emerging markets, BRICS markets, just to go like this, then don't go into them, because they're not going to go like this. They're going to go like this and like this and like this, and they're very, very unpredictable. So if you're looking for kind of predictable revenues, etc., then don't do that. But I think that's really behind this chart here, because as you can see in the rankings, China, UK, Asia Pacific, EU, India, Brazil. So they, in a sense, it's not, there's a real thorn in the side of BRICS in terms of where they are and them seeing them as growth prospects. So I think that what companies are doing are looking for stable revenues from mature markets and continuing to enter those at the same time as looking to China clearly, but then having a portfolio of other marketplaces as well. And that's clearly kind of coming through where organisations are at the moment. So then the kind of question is, when you're trying to do something like this, do you do an M&A deal, or do you go organically into a marketplace? And again, I think digital's got a role to play here, because if you're going to go into a market organically, then digital offers a new, both it's more rapid but also lower cost in terms of actually trying to get into a market nowadays. And so you can see here that there's a split here between where going into a kind of developed market, then the majority there are using organic means, i.e. basically they're using their own means. They're using things like digital, they're building their own branches, maybe whatever it is, in order to get into those markets. If they're going into developed high growth markets, then they're buying their way in. So they're kind of making acquisitions, doing strategic ventures, et cetera, which again kind of makes sense. But that it is again of that horses for courses in terms of where companies are and what they're planning to do at the present time. Now, trying to make sense of all this is pretty important, because one of the things is this going to continue? And obviously, if you were the Chancellor, you hope it would continue, given there's an election in a year's time. And trying to understand how much what are the different factors that are in here? So we came up with this kind of equation to try and kind of understand, you know, if you're a senior executive in one of these companies, what are the things that are going through your mind in order to actually make the decision to invest and go into some of these marketplaces? So there are some, obviously the things that are going on in the external marketplace in terms of how the economy is going, but other things as well, geopolitical and all those kind of things. How are financial markets doing? Is there stability there, et cetera, et cetera? So that's the external drivers. We think one of the most important things is around kind of ambition. You know, you may have heard Peter Drucker, who's a management guru. I mean, one of the things that he used to say is that culture eats strategy for breakfast every time. And in a sense, ambition is the main thing about this, which is, you know, do you have the culture and ambition within your organization, and particularly with the CEO, to go and attack these international markets? We run a program called the CEO Growth Escalator, which sounds a bit painful, but it's to help the CEOs, kind of, particularly from medium-sized businesses, think about how they can go international and how we can work with them. And you know, you can clearly see from the CEOs who have the ambition, have the capability to do this, from those that don't, and the ones that are successful are the ones that are there. So that plays a big role in terms of what's happening. Clearly, how you measure that is a little bit challenging. And then finally, there's the kind of corporate capabilities, which obviously they're kind of your ability to market, what your capabilities around digital are, but lots of other things like, you know, what's your capability around analytics, what's your supply chain like, depending on what business you're in, and what state are those in versus the kind of competition. And then, you know, the factor in all this is the expectation. And I think a lot of these things were in place up until about a year ago, but there wasn't as much expectation, particularly kind of from investors and financial markets and everything else. The expectation wasn't there. That has now kind of risen, and obviously you've got almost a self-fulfilling point. Just one last point on this, which is if one of these things was out of kilter, so let's say there was you know, something happened between Russia and Ukraine, et cetera, then part of the equation here is that could upset the 200 billion investment we talked about, because what we've kind of seen from doing this piece of research is that everything needs to be in position and aligned before they'll make the decision. So it still is pretty fragile, and I think one of the things we think is that that's still a hangover from the kind of financial crisis 6 years ago. If you look at the tenure of the people who answered this, so these are kind of board executives, et cetera, I can't remember the exact percentage, but something like 2/3 of them have been there longer than 6 years, and longer than 10 years, and about 80% longer than 6 years. So they'd all been around. Most of them have been around since the financial crisis, and I think you sort of see that coming through in that they are much more kind of cautious. So. In terms of making these decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So I mentioned at the beginning just a little bit about, so what should we do about this? I mean, is this down to the government? Is it down to business? Who's it down to in order to actually kind of make the UK kind of really kind of be a world beater in terms of what's going on in terms of the world economy, so we can ultimately generate wealth? So I'd be interested actually around the room, who thinks that it's government's responsibility alone in terms of the responsibility to get us on our knees and make us world beaters in terms of the economy? Anybody think it's just the government's responsibility? Lots of shaking heads. I'll take that as a no. What about, is it solely down to business? No. My guess is that you think it's a joint kind of thing then. I think that well, Vince Cable did to a degree, didn't he? I mean, not that we're going to get into detail, but yeah, that's the case. But I think that there is one of the points that we make in this report, actually, to your point, is that there is a challenge around what's here, actually. I mean, there's two things that we made a recommendation for. One was the macro stability. So regardless of an election, the one thing that will keep that equation going is macro stability. You know, the government can control, number one. And number two, if you look at the civil service, and I don't know if there are any civil servants here, and it's not a tag on, but there is a need for more, to your point, more sector-specific knowledge, more business knowledge within government, because government does need to help companies, and that doesn't really exist at the moment. And it's fine, say we'll buy some more consultants to help us do that. That's not really the kind of answer in the longer term. I think there is, as we say here, a greater emphasis needed about how we can do that. Now, I think business have got a role to play there, which is actually transferring some of the knowledge. If this is about, use the phrase all in it together, etc. But there is a need for business to do that more, I think, in terms of getting that conversation going. I mentioned before, I think there's also a culture thing, and one of our non-execs was talking to me about this, and he was saying, one thing he noticed, he said, I was in India quite recently, and there was a big trade fair and something like this, and all the Brits were hard at it selling and things like that, and then once the conference was finished, they were in the bar having a gin and tonic. The Germans, meanwhile, were actually having a conversation between the bigger businesses and the smaller businesses about how they could do better and sell more. It sounds like the World Cup, this, doesn't it? In terms of relative performance. But I think there's something in the culture which, to a degree, and I'm not saying because it pervades all British business, but what I was mentioning at the beginning about how competitive it is, the marketplace now is, and in a sense you can't take your foot off the gas in that way. And if you help each other in the way that the Germans do more with the Mittelstand and the way that they operate with their chambers of commerce, which are much more kind of linked into what they do, I think they can be more successful. So in terms of the kind of policy recommendations we made, one was around this macro stability, which was clear that it came out, and that's what's required. And the second thing is actually getting more sector specific. If you were thinking about having somebody who's a digital expert, you're not going to find them in government. But that you need to develop those kind of expertise in government so it can relate more to where they are. Where the country is and help investment decisions. I think from big businesses' point of view, I've already mentioned the point about having to raise trust, and I think that business certainly hasn't covered itself in glory and needs to do a lot more about what benefits it brings and some of the things it doesn't do so well. Number one, I think that we did ask the question here in terms of what they're doing around the supply chain. So we didn't say, are you, Mr. Big Business, helping other smaller businesses, yes or no? What we did is actually kind of say, what kind of activities have you got going on at the present time? And you can see that they came out quite strongly. So, 64% attractive payment terms, 61% of them deferring access to preferential access to contracts, offering direct lending, providing mentoring. So there are quite a few examples that people gave that they are actually doing this. And there's a degree of self-interest in this. There's an example that we came across where it was a very successful UK drinks company, which was doing very, very well. It outsourced down the supply chain its bottling plants, and because demand was so great, it needed more bottling. But the bottling company was a smaller company, and it didn't want to take the risk of investing in another furnace and building more bottles, et cetera, et cetera. So the bigger company couldn't grow. And eventually they came to an agreement about how the bigger company could help them with payment and use some of their balance sheets in order to help that process work, and it all ended happily ever after. But if that kind of interaction hadn't happened in the value chain, the small company didn't benefit, the bigger company didn't benefit. And we want to see more of those kind of things in terms of what's happening. And I think one of the things we're trying to do at Deloitte is actually kind of encourage our clients to engage in that kind of thing, if nothing else through self-interest, but actually I think it benefits everybody in the UK economy. So just to close for just the 5 big kind of questions, what's going on with facing clients in the marketplace. These are the kind of decisions they've got to make about, do they invest in the existing business, obviously, or into new growth-orientated investment? And that's the big kind of question about how much they do that. What about their kind of capabilities in terms of exporting and overseas markets? Which markets are the best for you to grow in? If you're talking about something that's around digital, obviously, having an understanding of that is very, very important. Organic versus inorganic, again, making those decisions is very, very difficult. we had one client who was on the growth escalator program that I was talking about, who's a packaging company up in Scotland, and they had a a distributor and a manufacturer of theirs in a partnership in China for a long time, and they'd never gone over to visit it. And the new CEO came in and said, "Oh, well, do we know what's going in? Because revenues and output doesn't seem to be rising in China at all. We don't seem to be getting any more customers. It's a big marketplace." So he sent somebody on the plane, and he went to visit their factory there, and the guy who ran it, and he found out that the guy who ran the factory had also built his own factory right next door. So he was taking all their products and all their ideas and packaging, and just basically producing it for himself from his own factory, and just kind of keeping the other one ticking over. So these are the kind of things when you go into China and places like this, which are very, very difficult to manage and understand, but you've got to get people on the ground who can do this. And then the final point is obviously for everybody in the UK about how does this get optimized. So that's a kind of brief run through about where we are in terms of kind of big business. Just one final point in terms of medium-sized businesses. We've seen a lot of good examples, and I was mentioning some of those at the beginning, particularly in kind of digital and tech. And when we have the questions and maybe a bit of debate, it'll be good to kind of maybe focus on those in terms of, how they do so well, why do they do so well, and where are those companies, and would we see more of them, particularly kind of in the regions. I think we're seeing some around the kind of northwest, but typically they're around London. And I think that's something that's of interest, particularly from where this goes in the future. But I will take questions later, I think, Richard, and I will pass back to you.
Thank you. Well, actually, if you just stand up, thank you.